Welcome everyone. My name is Shale Miller. I'm the Executive Director of Post Carbon Institute. And we're offering a short briefing about a report that we just released called Will Natural Gas Fuel America in the 21st Century? The purpose of the report was really to look at some key assumptions we felt were prevalent in the conversation amongst policymakers and the general public around the role that natural gas can and should play in our energy future. But before we begin with the report's author, David Hughes, giving a brief presentation about the key conclusions of the report, I just want to talk about some brief logistical matters. David's going to present for about 20 minutes or so using slides, and this briefing will be recorded and made available online afterwards. And then we have some questions that people have submitted, which I will be asking Dave at the conclusion of this presentation. And if anyone has any questions after listening to this, please feel free to email me directly. My email address is asher@postcarbon.org. So before we begin, I just want to give a little background. Post Carbon Institute is a nonprofit think tank based in California that's focused on the intersections of economic, environmental, energy, and equity issues. We have 29 fellows, not quite an A to Z of sustainability, but pretty close. We have some of the world's leading thinkers and practitioners, everyone from Erica Allen with Growing Power that's focused on urban food production and social justice, to Bill McKibben, who's one of the world's leading climate activists, to Dr. Peter Wybrow, who's a neuroscientist at UCLA focused on human behavior and consumption. Again, we did this report because we were concerned about ubiquitous assumptions that we've got 100 years of cheap and clean natural gas thanks to new techniques to drill shale gas. And we wanted to specifically look at some of the following questions. One is the EIA, the Energy Information Agency's projections for natural gas for the next 25 years. We also wanted to look at shale gas in comparison to coal, in particular around its greenhouse gas emissions. And then we wanted to look at some recommendations that people were making about switching of coal to natural gas for electricity production and oil to natural gas for transportation. Before we begin, again, I'm just going to give a brief bio of David Hughes, who's the author. David Hughes is a geoscientist who studied energy resources of Canada for nearly 4 decades, including 32 years with the Geological Survey of Canada as a scientist and research manager. He developed the National Coal Inventory to determine the availability and environmental constraints associated with Canada's coal resources. As team leader for unconventional gas on the Canadian Gas Potential Committee, he coordinated the recent publication of a comprehensive assessment of Canada's unconventional natural gas potential. Over the past decade, he has researched, published, and lectured widely on global energy and sustainability issues in North America and internationally. He's a board member of the Association for the Study of Peak Oil and Gas Canada and is a fellow of the Post Carbon Institute. He recently contributed to Carbon Shift, an anthology edited by Thomas Farmer Dixon on the twin issues of peak energy and climate change, and his work has been featured in numerous publications, magazines, newspapers, and he's also been on the radio and television quite often. He's currently president of a consultancy dedicated to research on energy and sustainability issues. So with that, thank you very much, Dave, for taking the time to run through the key findings of the report, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Asher. So as Asher mentioned, this report was put together to look at some of the assumptions on natural gas, and the 3 key assumptions were really the whole issue of new technology, hydraulic fracking and horizontal drilling, which really made a huge resource of shale gas available, and people began talking about 100 years of natural gas supply. Also, the price of natural gas has historically been very volatile, but now with the advent of shale gas, the naturally became cheap gas for decades to come. And the third assumption was that natural gas is much cleaner and safer than other fossil fuels. And if we switch to natural gas, we can address the greenhouse gas emissions, a so-called bridge fuel to a low-carbon future. So just a bit of background to look at the U.S. energy system, and in this case, energy consumption by source. And we can see that natural gas is about a quarter of U.S. consumption if we look at the left-hand side of this chart. And fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal, are 84% of U.S. consumption at this point in time. Only 16% is so-called non-carbon emitting fuels, renewables, biomass, large hydro, and nuclear. If we look at energy consumption by end-use sector, we can see that transportation is number 1 at 29%, And it turns out that basically just the energy that we lose in converting hydrocarbons to electricity and transmission losses are the second biggest consumer of energy in the U.S., followed by the industrial, residential, and commercial sectors. If we look at the use of natural gas by sector, we can see that only 30% of gas consumption was electricity in 2009. Natural gas is a very important fuel, as industrial feedstock for the industrial sector, things like petrochemicals and fertilizers, and for distributed heat in the commercial and residential sectors. A very small proportion of natural gas is forecast to be consumed in vehicles, that very thin line marked compressed gas over on the right-hand side. I should have said at the beginning that these are projections of the Energy Information Administration from its annual energy outlook of 2011. And so they projected consumption of energy out through 2035, and this is the reference case. If we look at greenhouse gas emissions, we can see that oil is the #1 source, followed by coal at 34% and natural gas at 23%, a little less than a quarter of CO2 emissions. And if we look at CO2 emissions by sector, we can see that the act of generating electricity produces 40% of U.S. CO2 emissions. Transportation, mainly motor vehicles, 34%, followed by the industrial, commercial, and residential sectors. This is the latest estimate of the U.S. Gas Potential Committee. It was published about 3 weeks ago now, and this is really the source of the 100-year gas statement that people like to use. About a little over a third of, and I should mention that these are resources, not reserves. Reserves being defined as being economically recoverable. So in total, there's about 1,900 trillion cubic feet of resources mapped out by the U.S. Gas Potential Committee. Of these, shale gas constitutes nearly 700 TCF, a little over a third. These are resources with different margins of error assigned to them. Basically, they're an additive of probability, probable, possible, and speculative resources. Possible and speculative have very limited amounts of information about them in terms of recoverability, and they constitute about 2/3 of this resource. And so I'm not really questioning that these resources are there. What I am questioning is how much of them can be produced at a given price, and that the recoverable resources is the really important part of this picture. In addition to these resources, the U.S. has reserves of about 273 trillion cubic feet, so that's a little over 12 years of known economically recoverable resources or reserves. If we look at the projection of U.S. gas supply by source, the EIA projection, again, a couple interesting things here. First of all sources of gas other than shale gas are projected to decline over this period. The only growth in this forecast is shale gas, and it's forecast to grow by nearly quadruple, 265% by 2035. It's interesting to note also that the Alaska pipeline, according to this forecast, is no longer needed because of the availability of shale gas. And lower 48 production is forecast to grow by 26% by 2035. If we look at the nature of the U.S. natural gas industry, this is the last 2 decades of production from wells and the average productivity of wells. And we can see that as of year-end 2010, there were over 500,000 producing gas wells in the U.S. The average productivity of those gas wells has declined by nearly 50% over the last 20 years. So more and more infrastructure and complexity to maintain and in recent years grow gas supply by a little bit. The nature of natural gas is really about depletion. Natural gas wells typically deplete at around 30 to 40% if we're talking a conventional gas well in the first year. If we're talking shale gas, depletions are typically much higher, typically between 65% and as much as 85% in the first year. And this is the history of gas drilling for the last couple of decades. We can see that throughout the 90s there was about 10,000 gas wells drilled per year. That rate of drilling nearly tripled, or more than tripled actually, in a bubble from about 2006 until mid-2008 when the Great Recession hit. That tripling of gas drilling allowed U.S. gas supply to grow. The Great Recession collapsed gas drilling. It's now down at about 20,000 wells per year. However, a lot of the wells that were drilled during that drilling bubble are still being tied in, and so we're still seeing a growth response in U.S. gas supply. In my view, drilling is going to have to increase in order to keep growing U.S. gas production. The historical gas price has been very volatile, and this looks at U.S., European gas prices, and also the price of LNG. You can see that the low gas price in North America is a relatively recent phenomenon. If you look back to June of 2008, gas prices in the U.S. were about $13 an MCF. Nonetheless, people are projecting these gas prices, these low gas prices, to continue indefinitely going forward. And the reason for that is shale gas. This is the distribution of shale basins in North America. Most of what we know about shale gas arose in the Barnett Shale in East Texas, but there's a lot of development in places like the Haynesville in Louisiana, the Fayetteville in Arkansas, and the Marcellus, mainly in Pennsylvania, has become a very hot shale play recently. There's a huge amount of hype surrounding shale gas. One of the major promoters is Aubrey McClendon, who is the CEO of Chesapeake, and he testified to Congress in 2008, basically stating things like, I believe natural gas can and should be the driving force for how this Congress can take bold action to free our country from the death grip of high prices for imported oil, thereby improving our economy, enhancing national security, and helping the environment. I believe U.S. natural gas producers can increase supply by 5% per year for at least the next decade, and that assumes there's no more access to public lands and waters than there is today. Compounded, that's 63% in 10 years. That's a very tall statement, and I'm not sure that McClendon would agree with his own statement today, given what's happened in the last couple of years. One of the most prominent naysayers in terms of shale gas is Arthur Berman. He's a geologist living in Houston. And this was out of his ASPO presentation of last October in Washington. Shale plays are marginally commercial at best. Average well life was much shorter than predicted, and the volume of commercially recoverable gas has been greatly overstated. These plays have consistently contracted to a core area that represents 10 to 20% of the resource that was initially claimed. The manufacturing model has failed, and in fact, the manufacturing model, which was the initial model of shale gas, was that you could drill a shale gas well pretty much anywhere within a play and get similar results. This whole concept of core areas has been proven now. In the Barnett, it's contracted to two main core areas. The Fayetteville, one main core area. The Haynesville, the same thing, 10 to 20% of what was originally defined as the fourth largest gas field in the world. The Marcellus in Pennsylvania has contracted to two core areas. These are not low-cost plays. The marginal cost of production for most companies is $7.50 an MCF based on regulatory filings. The price of gas today is a little above $4, hence the statement that it's a marginal source of gas. And in fact, if you look at the companies that got in early into the core areas of a place like the Fayetteville, they are making money at today's gas prices. Companies that got in late at very high land prices are not making money. It's very marginal for them. Reserves have been greatly overstated, and 80% of reserves are undeveloped. This is the technology that really made shale gas viable. Horizontal drilling with multiple fracture stages. Some of the wells being drilled up in Canada have laterals of over 5,000 feet vertically or horizontally, and with more than 20 individual frac stages. So these are expensive wells and complex. The whole fracking process involves injecting anywhere from 2 to 6 million gallons of water with a fracking fluid, and somewhere between 30 and 70% of that water is produced back out of the well and has to be disposed of on the surface. This is frac fluid being basically stored on the surface in a holding pond, and this is very toxic material. It's disposed of typically either by re-injecting it back into the ground, by recycling it somehow, or by treating it in wastewater treatment plants on the surface. And that resulted in a major article in the New York Times about 2 months ago now, basically putting these frac fluids through wastewater treatment plants that weren't designed to get rid of some of the things in the water, in particular radioactivity. Companies don't inject radioactive materials into the well. However, the saline formation water that's produced with the frac fluids does have radioactivity in it in some cases. The EIA has become ever more enamored with shale gas, and this is through their forecast the last 3 years, basically looking at the proportion of supply that's to come from shale gas. 2009, 16% by 2030. 2010, 26% by 2035. 2011, 45% by 2035. I'm not suggesting that this can't happen. It's just what's it going to take in terms of infrastructure and number of wells in order to make it happen. The EIA projection of gas price going forward, we can see how volatile gas has been historically, yet the EIA is suggesting basically a very slow increase in gas prices through 2035 with no volatility. And if you remember Arthur Berman's marginal cost of production of $7.50, the EIA is projecting that U.S. gas prices are going to be below that through 2035. As I mentioned earlier, the story of natural gas is a story about depletion. And this is the production of natural gas in the U.S. by well vintage. And it turns out that as of year-end 2006, 60% of U.S. production was from the most recent 4 years. So you really have to keep drilling in order to keep production stable or to increase it. This is a very important chart which basically picks up on that theme. The dashed blue line in the middle and to the right is the EIA's projection of the number of wells required to meet its production forecast. The dark blue line on the left is historical drilling rates. And in my view, we'll have to return to at least 30,000 wells per year to begin significantly growing U.S. gas supply. And if we're going to meet the EIA's forecast gas production through 2035, I think we're going to probably have to grow drilling rates to about 40,000 by that time in order to increase supply. If the EIA's forecast of drilling rates is correct, I would project a decline in supply, and that's the dashed bold red line, basically declining through 2035 if we can't pick up drilling rates. This is U.S. gas, U.S. electricity generation by fuel. We can see that today about 45% of generation is provided by coal, 23% by gas. With the EIA's projection, coal will decline in terms of market share, but basically increase in real terms going forward through 2035. Natural gas will increase in real terms and in market share, but not a significant substitution of natural gas for electricity. If we look at things like non-hydro renewables and biomass, they currently make up only about 4% of U.S. generation. Important, yes, but when we look at the amount of electricity provided by fossil fuels, there's really nothing out there that can effectively substitute for it at this point in time. The distribution of natural gas generating or electricity generating facilities in the U.S. By fuel source, we can see the coal is generally larger plants, many of them concentrated in the eastern part of the U.S. as well as in the Midwest. Natural gas, although there are some large plants in places like Florida, in general, they tend to be smaller and much wider distributed across the country. And it turns out if we look at the historical construction of natural gas and coal plants, there's more natural gas plants in the U.S. than there is coal, and there's more cumulative generating capacity in terms of natural gas than there is coal. However, coal generates more than twice the amount of electricity as natural gas in the U.S., and that's because of price and the suitability of coal for baseload generation. You know, the so-called capacity factor of the average coal plant in the U.S. is about 65%, whereas the capacity factor of natural gas is only about 35%. And it's just really the nature of the fuels. Natural gas is a very useful form of generation for balancing intermittent loads and peak loads. So it's very good at balancing renewables, things like wind and photovoltaics. Whereas coal basically needs to chug along at a constant rate as a provider of baseload. If we look at what it would take to replace coal generation in the U.S. with natural gas, this is what natural gas supply would have to look like. In essence, lower 48 natural gas production would have to increase by 64% over and above current production rates, and by 52% over and above the increased supply projected by the EIA. Likely an impossibility. I mean, the amount of drilling it would take to do that would be virtually impossible. There's also the question of full cycle greenhouse gas emissions from natural gas. A controversial study was published by Bob Howes from Cornell in early April. And Bob projected, this basically compares surface and underground mine coal emissions to shale gas and conventional gas. Now if you look at shale gas, which is in the red, Howes is basically saying that shale gas is somewhere between 20 and 90% worse than coal from a full cycle global warming point of view, and that's because of methane. Fugitive methane emissions. Methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, although its residence time in the atmosphere is much shorter than carbon dioxide. And if you look at it on a 20-year time frame, and there's basically two estimates of the potency of methane compared to CO2 on this chart. The IPCC suggests that on a 20-year time frame, methane is 72 times as potent as CO2. A new estimate by Schindel in 2009 suggests that methane is 105 times as potent as CO2. If you roll that out to the 100-year time frame, shale gas and coal are roughly equal. Our coal is a little bit worse than methane. If we're looking at natural gas as a bridge fuel, however, we should likely be looking at the next 2 or 3 decades in terms of global warming potential. To compare gas and coal, you really should be comparing it on an electricity basis. Most coal is used for generating electricity, and natural gas is typically more efficient than coal in terms of generation efficiency. And so if you look at this chart, in essence, out to beyond the 20-year time frame, the existing natural gas fleet is worse than coal from a greenhouse gas point of view. If you look at best-in-class coal and gas technologies, gas would be worse than coal for even longer into the future. So likely, the 30, 40-year time frame. The critics of Howard's study, and there are many of them, suggest, well, we can just capture those fugitive methane emissions. And there's a big incentive to do that. If you look at the data that Howard used on the Haynesville, for example, the flowback portion of that gas released into the atmosphere is worth about $1 million. So there's a big incentive to apply technology to reduce those methane emissions. The Governmental Accounting Office published a study near the end of 2010 that looked at that. They felt they were losing royalties from vented methane on federal leases. And they concluded that with existing capture technology, roughly 40% of that methane should be able to be captured. So this chart looks at what that would mean in terms of a comparison to coal, and it still turns out that in the likely the 15 to 30-year time frame, coal is still better than natural gas from a greenhouse gas emission point of view. If we look at vehicles, the so-called Pickens plan, for example, has looked at substituting at least the heavy truck fleet, moving it from oil to natural gas. What would that take? If we look at how we use oil, in the U.S., roughly 80% is consumed by transport. Light and heavy vehicles amount to about 80% of the transportation fuel burned. Heavy trucks, about 19%. What would it take in terms of increased supply of natural gas in order to replace heavy vehicles? It turns out lower 48 production will have to grow about 24%, about a quarter, at today's production rates, and about 28% at the projected production rates of 2035. If we added light vehicles to that, we're looking at 100% growth in gas production today, and close to that in 2035, an impossibility. The key takeaways from this report: number one, the ability of natural gas to substantially replace coal for electricity or oil for transport in the longer term is very limited. Certainly not possible with the existing EIA production outlook. Maintaining and growing natural gas production as projected by the EIA will require higher prices and will be capital-intensive, a capital-intensive geological and environmental challenge. Even if we are able to achieve the EIA's forecast, it will not allow for significant replacement of coal or oil in current business-as-usual projections. The mantra of natural gas as a clean bridge fuel to a renewable energy future is highly suspect because of its environmental footprint, both on the landscape as well as its lack of ability to scale to significantly replace things like vehicles or coal-fired generation, and the full cycle greenhouse gas emissions. When it comes to fossil fuels, there's no free lunch. They do provide such a large proportion of our energy consumption that they will be very important inputs going forward. What this tells you is we have to deploy them to their maximum advantage, as well as minimizing their environmental impact. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dave. So I'm just going to ask a few questions that we received from people listening into the briefing. The first one is a little bit more around the greenhouse gas implications. You mentioned the Howard study at Cornell and how that was received with some controversy. And I know that your own work in this report has tried to look at some of the criticism, for example, capturing fugitive methane emissions. But do you have any recommendations for the course of action to look more deeply at this? I think the conclusion that some people come away from, and Howard even said in his report, is that more analysis needs to be done. So what would you say about that?
Well, I would say, first of all, in the report I tried to cite some data independent of Howard. And the best data set is really the EPA, who concluded that fugitive emissions in total are about 4.2%. And that's sort of in the upper range of Howard if you take away the transportation aspect. The EPA also recognizes that the data are not what they could be. And they proposed a series of regulations that was set to take effect in January of this year, with the first full report in March of 2012. And really that would force companies to provide a lot better information on fugitive methane. Whether those regulations actually come into effect or not remains to be seen, as the American Petroleum Institute has filed a petition questioning those regulations, so we'll see how that works out. But definitely, we need better data.
Thanks. Here's another question. If production slows over the next few years and the glut disappears, as U.S. power companies switch from coal to gas to meet new EPA air quality regulations, won't gas prices just increase and then stimulate aggressive new production?
I definitely think these low current gas prices are an anomaly, and they will likely disappear shortly, especially if drilling rates don't pick up. But I think I pointed out that we need a lot more drilling. We need to basically increase drilling by about 50%. Just to keep growing gas supply per the EIA outlook. So, that drilling's not going to happen unless gas prices rise significantly. So, yes, gas prices are going to go up. Yes, supply could increase somewhat, but not to, the panacea levels that some people are talking about.
Thanks. Now, how do LNG exports play in the gas prices? And maybe you can actually also talk about imports of liquefied natural gas from elsewhere.
Well, if you look at the international price of LNG, it's close to double the price of domestic gas in America. And that's why people are talking about building export facilities. And in fact, I think that's underway on a couple of the regasification import facilities. So they're basically turning them into two-way transfer points. If we start to export significant amounts of natural gas, that's likely to impact domestic prices. Are likely to go higher. If you look at imports of LNG, there's been a huge build-out of LNG import capacity in the U.S., and that's basically been sitting almost empty because of the glut of natural gas in the U.S. So, people have basically lost their shirts on a lot of that import capacity. It doesn't make any sense to import it at double the price of domestic gas.
Okay, now here's another question. How valid are concerns about water pollution from fracking, in your opinion? The industry continues to dismiss those concerns.
Well, I think, undoubtedly there has been incidences. For example, Chesapeake had a blowout in Pennsylvania a few weeks ago, and spewed an awful lot of toxic frack fluid over the landscape to the point that they've suspended fracking in Pennsylvania at this point in time. But in general, in terms of groundwater contamination from fracking, personally I think that's more related to casing failures near surface. If the industry effectively takes care of the the fracking is happening a long ways below surface. A more serious concern is the disposal of the produced frac fluids from the operation. And as I mentioned earlier, that's done by reinjection, which kind of gets rid of it permanently. However, it has caused induced earthquakes in places like Arkansas. Or they recycle it, which still leaves a lot of toxic residue that has to be disposed of. Or they treat it in wastewater treatment plants. And as I mentioned, some of those plants are not really set up to get rid of some of the pollutants in the frac fluid, which has resulted in a study that was published by the New York Times in mid-March.
Here's another question that's sort of a follow-up to the question about production slowing, thus increasing prices, and then new investment being made. Is it feasible to replace some 20% of coal-fired generation with gas over the next decade? A lot of people are not necessarily pushing for 100% replacement. They're targeting more 20% based upon the EPA's new regulations in terms of retiring plants. So can you talk about what it would look like to do, maybe a 20% switching?
20% would require significantly ramping up production over and above the EIA's projection, which is still pretty bullish. I mean, that's almost a quadrupling of shale gas. That would take a lot of effort. I'm not saying it couldn't be done, but it would really take a lot of effort in order to do that. If you look at the new EPA coal regulations, which are set to take effect in 2015, I think that will take close to 20% of the really old plants. Basically, it doesn't make any economic sense to retrofit them with the pollution controls that will be required. And so they will probably be shut down. I would expect that there will be new best-in-class coal plants built to replace them, as well as natural gas plants. I can't see that replacing it all with natural gas. The effect that would have on gas price would be dramatic, I would say.
And then I think the question from an environmental perspective is, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about this. There's obviously a range of estimates for the greenhouse gas impacts of methane. And there's also this question about, a 20-year time frame versus a 100-year time frame. Can you talk a little bit about why it's important to maybe look more at the 20 to 30-year time frame than just a 100-year time frame, which I know is sort of the standard time frame that people use for CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, I think if you can see the effect, if we do have a wholesale replacement of coal with natural gas, and it actually is significantly worse over the 20 or 30-year time frame. I think that's going to really be counterproductive in terms of what we're trying to do with greenhouse gas emissions. Going forward, the number one strategy, in my view, is to use less. If you don't burn hydrocarbons, they don't produce any greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that really has to be our number one focus. I don't think that the supply side is really going to work as a short-term transition strategy. We really need to work on the demand side as much as possible.
Can you talk a little bit more about cogeneration then, for folks who don't know what that is?
Sure. One of the major strategies that I would see to reduce CO2 emissions both from coal and gas is making better use of the heat that comes out of those plants, and that's called combined heat and power. It's not done very much in North America at this point, but it's done a lot in Europe. And if you look at Denmark, for example, this is maybe one of the best examples. More than half of Danish homes are heated with district heat, basically generated in conjunction with the production of electricity. Denmark has some of the most efficient coal plants in the world, and those are ultra-supercritical plants. They're about 25% more efficient than the existing U.S. coal fleet, for example. And therefore, they use 25% less fuel and produce 25% less CO2 emissions. But in Denmark, all the waste heat from those plants is captured and utilized either for district heating, low-grade heat, or as processed heat for industrial operations. And if you can capture the waste heat from a coal plant, you can raise the overall efficiency to 70% or higher. So that's roughly double the efficiency of the existing coal plants, and hence 50% less CO2 emissions, 50% less hydrocarbon fuel that would otherwise have to be burned, with the same amount of utility coming out of those plants. So, those are the kinds of strategies that I think we need going forward.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Dave. That's it for the questions we've had submitted right now. I want to remind folks who are listening that if any questions come up, either from having listened to this briefing or from having read the report, they should feel free to email me, and we'll do our best to try to get answers to people. We really intended this report to be a conversation starter and to really look at testing some of the basic assumptions that we felt people had on all sides of the aisle when it came to the controversy over shale gas. So feel free to email me directly. My name again is Asher Miller, and my email address is asher@postcarbon.org. I also just want to let people know, obviously you can find the report on our website at postcarbon.org/natural gas. But I wanted to let folks know that we're also going to be releasing a few supplemental pieces written by a few of our other fellows, looking a little more at the implications on public health. So we have two public health fellows who are both doctors and faculty at the Bloomberg Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and they've written a short supplemental piece just looking at some of the questions around public health related to shale gas. And then we also have a short supplemental piece looking a little bit more at the transportation question. And then another piece actually looking at the role of natural gas in terms of the industrial agricultural system, which I think people tend not to think about too often, but it plays a very key role in our agricultural system. So those will be released shortly. And we will make this briefing available online for folks. So thank you again, Dave, so much for the report and for taking the time to do this briefing. And we'll talk soon.
You're very welcome.
Bye-bye.